The Grand Ashworth Hotel had seen better days, and so had Walter Haynes. Both stood quietly in the gray November morning. The hotel with its faded brass fixtures and its carpets worn thin by 1,000 footsteps, and Walter with his stooped shoulders and his careful, unhurried walk. He arrived at 6:15 every morning, the same as he had for the past 11 years, his old navy coat buttoned to the collar against the Philadelphia chill, a thermos of black coffee tucked under one arm, and a ring of keys that jangled softly with each step. A small, familiar music that the early morning corridors had long since stopped noticing. Walter was 74 years old, and the world had mostly forgotten to look at him. He was the hotel's maintenance man, not the manager, not the concierge who stood at the front desk with a practiced smile and a pressed suit. Walter was the man who came before all of that, before the guests arrived, before the chandeliers were switched on, before the grand ballroom smelled of anything other than wood polish and the faint ghost of old cigarettes. He fixed what was broken. He tightened what had come loose. He moved through the building like a quiet tide, leaving everything better than he found it and asking nothing in return. His hands told the whole story of his life, if anyone had thought to look. They were large hands, once strong in the way that only a working man's hands become strong, with knuckles swollen now from the arthritis that visited him each winter like an unwelcome tenant. The skin was mapped with small scars, each one a memory, a slip of a wrench here, a burn from a boiler pipe there. The right index finger had a permanent slight curve to it, the result of a break that never healed quite right back in 1987. And yet, for all their roughness, there was something else about those hands, something Walter himself no longer spoke of, a particular care with which he placed them, a stillness when he was at rest, as though they remembered another life entirely. He had been married once to a woman named Ruth. Ruth had called his hands beautiful, which had always made Walter laugh, a real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest. She had said it the first time she saw him play, 46 years ago, in a small recital hall in Boston, where the seats were half empty, and the upright piano needed tuning, and none of it mattered, because the music that came out of Walter Haynes that evening had stilled every conversation in the room. Ruth had been in the third row. She had not looked away once. She had been gone for 7 years now, 7 years of mornings without her voice, 7 years of keeping the thermos filled and the keys jangling and the hands busy, because busy hands could not reach for something that was no longer there. Walter did not speak of the piano anymore. He had not played since her funeral, since the moment he had sat at the old upright in their living room to play her favorite piece, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, and found that, halfway through, his hands had simply stopped. Not from the arthritis, not from forgetting. They had stopped because continuing felt in that moment like a cruelty he could not explain. The piano sat in the living room still, closed, waiting. He thought of it sometimes, walking the hotel corridors. He thought of Ruth. He thought of the boy he had been, 23, reckless with talent, offered a place at the Curtis Institute that he had turned down because his father was ill, and the family needed money and someone had to be responsible. He had told himself he would return to it. He had believed that for a long time. Life, as it so often does, had quietly made other arrangements. On this particular Tuesday morning in November, Walter arrived to find the Grand Ashworth buzzing with a different energy. Vans were parked along the side entrance. Men in black shirts carried equipment through the service doors. Someone had strung cable ties along the corridor railing, something Walter would have to deal with later, a hazard for elderly guests, and the ballroom doors, usually locked until noon, stood wide open. He stopped a passing young woman with a clipboard. "What's happening in the ballroom?" he asked. She looked up from her papers the way people sometimes looked at Walter briefly, without quite focusing. "Classical music showcase," she said, already moving again. "Invitation only, some kind of talent search for undiscovered artists, big names on the panel." Walter nodded slowly. He looked through the open ballroom doors for just a moment. The stage had been set up at the far end, and there, beneath a single overhead light that had not yet been fully adjusted, stood a grand piano, a Steinway Model D, its black lacquer gleaming like still water. Walter stood very still. His hands, hanging at his sides, trembled once, and then were quiet. He turned away and went to find his tools. There was a leaking pipe on the third floor that needed his attention, and the cable ties in the corridor needed removing before someone was hurt. He was, after all, the maintenance man. No one had invited him anywhere. But as he walked away, he did not hear the footsteps behind him, the slow, deliberate steps of a man who had paused in the ballroom doorway, watching him. An older gentleman, silver-haired, with a program tucked under his arm and something unreadable in his expression. The man watched Walter disappear around the corner. Then he looked back at the Steinway. And he frowned slowly, thoughtfully, as though something had just occurred to him that he could not yet put into words. Walter Haynes went upstairs to fix a leaking pipe. He did not know that by evening, nothing in the Grand Ashworth Hotel and nothing in his quiet, invisible life would ever be quite the same again. By 10 o'clock, the Grand Ashworth had transformed itself. The ballroom, which Walter had polished and maintained for 11 quiet years, now belonged to other people. Guests in tailored suits and silk blouses moved through its doors with the easy confidence of those who had never once questioned whether they belonged somewhere. The chandeliers, the very ones Walter had climbed a ladder to clean, bulb by bulb, just 3 weeks prior, blazed at full brilliance, throwing warm gold light across the rows of velvet-seated chairs that had been arranged in careful semicircles before the stage. The Steinway sat at the center of it all like a dark, patient heart. Walter passed the ballroom twice that morning, once carrying his toolbox toward the service corridor, and once returning from the third-floor pipe, his hands still faintly damp, a streak of rust along his left forearm. He kept his eyes forward. He had learned over the years the particular art of moving through spaces where he was not meant to be seen. It was not a skill he had sought. It had simply accumulated, the way rust accumulates slowly and without announcement. It was on his second pass that it happened. He had stopped just briefly, just for a moment, because one of the ballroom's side doors had swung partially open and the latch was catching wrong, a problem he had meant to address last week and had not gotten to. He crouched down with the quiet efficiency of a man who has spent a lifetime fixing things others do not notice, and he was examining the latch mechanism when the voice came from behind him. "Excuse me." It was not said kindly. Walter straightened and turned. The man standing before him was perhaps 35, no more, with the kind of jawline that suggested he had been told he was impressive for most of his life and had come to agree. He wore a dark charcoal suit without a tie, the collar open in the manner of men who wish to suggest both wealth and casualness simultaneously. A lanyard hung around his neck bearing the words, "Festival Director, ASHWORTH Classical Showcase." His name, Walter would later learn, was Dominic Farrow. Behind him stood 2 assistants, both young, both holding tablets, both watching with the mild curiosity of people who have grown accustomed to watching their employer handle situations. "This is a private event," Dominic said. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. "The service entrance is on the other side of the building." Walter looked at him calmly. "I'm aware of that, I work here." "The door latch on this side." "I don't need a report on the door," Dominic said, and there was something in the way he said it, not quite a sneer, but the close cousin of one, that made one of the assistants look briefly at her shoes. "What I need is for the maintenance staff not to be wandering through the guest areas during a private showcase. Is that something we can arrange?" There was a pause. Walter held the man's gaze for a moment, just a moment, and in that moment something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not humiliation, something quieter than both, something that had been pressed down for a very long time and had grown, through years of pressing, into a kind of bedrock. "Of course," Walter said, "that was all." 2 words, delivered without inflection, without apology, without any of the shrinking that Dominic Farrow had perhaps expected. Walter picked up his toolbox, tucked it under his arm, and walked, not hurried, not shuffling, but walking with the measured pace of a man who has somewhere to be and knows how to get there, back toward the service corridor. Dominic watched him go with a slight frown, as though something about the exchange had not satisfied him in the way he had anticipated. One of his assistants, a young woman named Clara, 26 years old, who had grown up watching her grandfather tend a garden with that same unhurried dignity, felt a tightening in her throat that she could not explain and did not try to. She looked once more at the retreating figure of the old man in the navy coat. Then she looked at Dominic. Then she looked at her tablet and said nothing. In the service corridor, Walter set down his toolbox, unscrewed his thermos, and poured himself a careful measure of black coffee. His hands were steady. He looked at the wall in front of him, bare concrete, a strip of fluorescent light overhead, and he breathed in slowly and breathed out slowly, and he thought of Ruth. You never needed them to see you, she would have said. You only ever needed to see yourself. He finished his coffee. He screwed the cap back on. He had 3 more jobs before lunch. A faulty electrical socket on the 2nd floor, a broken towel rail in room 14, and the cable ties in the corridor that still needed removing. He gathered himself quietly, completely, and went back to work. The afternoon settled over the Grand Ashworth like a held breath. In the ballroom, the showcase had begun. Walter could hear it from the service corridor, fragments of music drifting through the walls and the old building's bones, the way sound travels in structures that were built to last. A young violinist, a mezzo-soprano with a voice like warm amber, a pianist, no older than 20, whose technique was clean and certain and somehow, despite all of that, left Walter with the feeling of a beautifully constructed sentence that had nothing particular to say. He worked. He did not listen, or he tried not to. The faulty socket on the 2nd floor turned out to be more complicated than the work order had suggested. It always was, and he spent 40 minutes on his knees behind a panel in the wall, working by the small beam of a headlamp, his arthritic hands coaxing and persuading the wiring with a patience that few people under 50 still possessed. The arthritis was worse today. The cold did that. He worked through it the way he had always worked through discomfort, which was to say, he acknowledged it, made no drama of it, and continued. It was on his way back down the service stairwell that he passed the ballroom's rear entrance, a staff door, propped open by someone who had needed to carry equipment through and had not bothered to close it properly. And through that open door, across 30 feet of polished floor and empty chairs, Walter saw the Steinway. The current performer had stepped away from it momentarily, some issue with sheet music, a brief exchange with the panel, and the piano sat unattended, its lid raised, its keys gleaming in the stage light with a kind of patient invitation. Walter stopped. He did not know how long he stood there. A few seconds, perhaps longer. It is difficult to measure time when something inside you has gone very still. His right hand rose just slightly at his side. The fingers moved almost imperceptibly in the sequence of an opening phrase. Chopin, the E-flat major, the piece he had not let himself finish in 7 years. He was not aware he was doing it. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice came from beside him, gentle, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who has learned to speak without startling people. Walter turned. It was the silver-haired man he had not known was watching him that morning. Up close he was perhaps 70, with deep-set eyes the color of pale winter sky and the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in concert halls, not performing in them but listening, truly listening. There is a difference, and it shows in the posture. The man's name was Edmund Hale. Walter did not know this yet. What he knew was that the man was looking at him with an expression that was not pity and not curiosity, but something rarer, the look of someone who has just recognized a language they did not expect to hear spoken here. That piano, Edmund said, nodding toward the Steinway. A 1986 Model D, one of the finest years. You can tell by the bass register. There's a depth to it that the newer ones don't quite replicate. He said it the way one might say it to a colleague, an equal. Walter looked at him carefully. The touch is heavier in the upper register on the 86s, he said, and it came out of him the way things come out that have been held in too long. Naturally, easily, before he could decide not to say it, Edmund turned to look at him fully then. "You play," he said. It was not a question. Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the piano. Then he picked up his toolbox, which he had set down without realizing it. "I used to," he said. He walked away before Edmund could respond. But Edmund Hale, who had spent 40 years as a senior director of the Philadelphia Chamber Music Society, who had discovered 3 internationally recognized soloists in that time, who had learned above all else to trust the recognition that sometimes arrived without explanation, stood in the doorway of the staff entrance for a long moment after Walter had gone. He looked at the piano, he looked at the empty corridor, and then, moving with quiet deliberateness, he went to find the festival's program director. What he said to her, Walter would not learn until later. But Clara, the young assistant who had watched Walter walk away that morning with something tightening in her throat, happened to be standing nearby when Edmund spoke, and she heard enough to understand that the afternoon was not over yet, that in fact it had not yet truly begun. It happened at 4:17 in the afternoon. The showcase had reached its final scheduled performer, a young pianist from New York, polished and well-credentialed, who had withdrawn that morning with a hand injury. The slot was empty. The panel, 4 people seated behind a long table at the edge of the stage, was deliberating about how to close the program. Dominic Farrow was speaking with the controlled irritation of a man whose carefully arranged afternoon had developed an inconvenient gap. "We'll simply end early," he was saying. "It's not ideal, but—" "There is someone," Edmund Hale said. He had taken a seat at the panel table 20 minutes earlier, introduced. Walter later learned, as a visiting observer, a courtesy extended to a man of his reputation. He said it quietly, the way people say things they are certain of. Dominic looked at him. "I beg your pardon. There is someone in this building who should play that piano before this afternoon is done." A pause. "Edmund, the program is—" "I know what the program is." Edmund set down his pen. "I am telling you that I have been in this field for 40 years. I have sat in rooms where something true was happening and rooms where something practiced was happening, and I have learned, sometimes too slowly, to know the difference. There is a man in this building." He paused. "Would you trust me just this once to go and ask him?" Clara was already moving. She found Walter in the basement, returning his toolbox to the maintenance room at the end of his shift. His coat was back on. His thermos was under his arm. He was preparing, as he did every day, to walk out through the service entrance into the gray Philadelphia evening and take the bus home to a house with a closed piano in the living room. "Mr. Haynes," Clara said. He turned. She was slightly out of breath. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen directed at himself in a very long time. Urgency, yes, but beneath it, something that resembled hope. She told him what Edmund had said. She told him about the empty slot. She told him, and this she said carefully, watching his face, that no one was asking him to audition. No one was asking him to prove anything. There was simply a Steinway on a stage, and an afternoon that still had a few minutes left in it, and a man upstairs who believed, for reasons he could not fully articulate, that something important was about to happen. Walter listened to all of this without expression. Then he looked down at his hands. The arthritis ached. The cold had settled into his knuckles like a slow fire. He thought of the last time he had sat before a piano, Ruth's living room, the unfinished nocturne, the hands that had stopped. He thought of the Curtis Institute letter he had declined in 1973. He thought of his father and the years of overtime and the 1,000 small surrenders that had added up, without his noticing, into a life. He thought of Ruth saying, "You only ever needed to see yourself. "I haven't played," he said slowly, "in 7 years." "I know," Clara said. "Edmund knows that too." Another silence. Walter buttoned the top button of his navy coat. He picked up his thermos. He looked at the door to the service entrance, the familiar exit, the bus stop, the quiet house. Then he looked at Clara. "Lead the way," he said. The ballroom went quiet in a particular way when Walter walked in. Not the hush of recognition. No one there recognized him as anything other than what they had seen that morning. An old man in a maintenance uniform, out of place, belonging elsewhere. Dominic Farrow, seated at the panel table, went visibly rigid. He leaned toward the woman beside him and said something low and sharp. The woman looked uncertain. Edmund Hale said nothing. He watched Walter cross the ballroom floor with his hands folded on the table in front of him, and his expression was the expression of a man waiting for something he has waited a long time to see. Walter reached the stage steps. He climbed them carefully because the arthritis made stairs something to be negotiated, and he walked to the piano bench and he sat down. The room held perhaps 60 people, guests, panel members, staff. Clara stood near the back, her tablet held against her chest, not looking at it. Walter sat before the Steinway for a long moment, not touching it. He looked at the keys, white and black and patient, the way they had always been. The way they had been in the recital hall in Boston in 1974 when Ruth was in the 3rd row and the world was still open and everything was still possible. His hands came to rest on the keys, not pressing, just resting, requainting, and then so softly at first that the people in the back of the room leaned forward without knowing they were doing it, he began to play. Chopin, the Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, No. 2. The first phrase moved through the ballroom like a change in the weather. It was not the playing of a young man. It was not pristine. There were places where the arthritis whispered in the edges of a chord, where a note arrived a fraction late, carried tenderly by hands that had known real difficulty. But this was precisely what made the room go still in the way that it did. Because what came from that piano was not technique alone, though the technique was extraordinary. What came from that piano was 74 years of living, pressed into sound. It was Ruth in the 3rd row. It was a letter from the Curtis Institute and a father who needed help, and a decision made without bitterness. It was 11 years of early mornings and thermos coffee and keys that jangled in empty corridors. It was grief and endurance and the specific tenderness of someone who has lost the most important person in their world and has gone on anyway, not triumphantly, but honestly, one quiet day at a time. The nocturne bloomed and breathed and spoke, and the room did not move. Not one person moved. Dominic Farrow had gone very still. His hand, which had been resting on the table, had slowly closed into a loose fist, not in anger, but in the involuntary way the body responds when something has reached it before the mind has had a chance to prepare defenses. A woman in the 2nd row, 60 years old, who had played piano herself as a girl and given it up for reasons she had spent decades not examining, began to cry without warning, silently, her hand rising to her mouth. Edmund Hale sat with his eyes closed and his head very slightly bowed, and Walter played. He played the whole piece. He did not stop this time halfway through. He played it to its end, to its quiet, gentle, inevitable resolution, and when the final chord faded into the ballroom's air, he sat for a moment with his hands still on the keys, his eyes closed, and he said goodbye to something he had been carrying for 7 years. Then the silence came. It lasted, by Clara's count, though she was not entirely certain she was counting, perhaps 8 seconds. 8 seconds in which 60 people sat in a gilded ballroom in Philadelphia and did not breathe. The applause, when it came, was not the polite, measured kind. It began with the woman in the 2nd row, who was still crying, who stood first, not in the coordinated way of organized standing ovations, but in the helpless way of someone whose body has acted before her thoughts caught up. Then the man beside her. Then a ripple backward through the rows, chair legs scraping softly on the polished floor, until the entire room was standing, and the applause filled the ballroom's high ceilings and the crystal chandeliers that Walter had cleaned, bulb by bulb, 3 weeks prior trembled faintly with the sound of it. Walter sat at the piano and did not move for a moment. He was not absorbing triumph. He was somewhere else entirely, back in a living room in 1974, Ruth saying beautiful for the first time, her hands folded in her lap, her face lit with something he had spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of. He was at his father's kitchen table making a decision. He was in a hospital corridor 7 years ago, holding Ruth's hand until it went still. He was, in some sense, in all of these places at once. And then he came back to the room and he heard the applause and he blinked once. Edmund Hale had come to the edge of the stage. He stood there, not performing emotion, simply experiencing it, the way men of long experience sometimes do, and when Walter looked up and found his eyes, Edmund gave a single, small nod. The nod of one craftsman to another. Of recognition, long overdue. Dominic Farrow had not stood immediately. He had remained in his chair for several seconds after everyone else had risen, and this had not been stubbornness but something closer to shock. The genuine, disorienting kind that arrives when the world reorganizes itself without your permission. He was 35 years old and he was good at his work, and he had moved through his career with the confidence of someone who knew how to assess value. He had looked at Walter Haynes that morning, and he had seen a maintenance man. An old man, a person adjacent to the event, not part of it. He had been so completely wrong that he was struggling in these seconds to hold both versions of reality in his mind simultaneously. He stood, slowly. He did not clap loudly or with any performance of enthusiasm. He clapped steadily, quietly, with a kind of deliberateness, looking at Walter the entire time. His face had lost the easy confidence of the morning. In its place was something younger and less certain, and perhaps, if one were charitable, something that would eventually become better. Clara, at the back of the room, was not clapping yet. She was watching Walter's face. She had been raised by people of a certain generation, people who had worked hard and spoken little about it, who had given more than they kept and not made speeches about the giving. Her grandfather had been such a person. He had died 3 years ago in the spring, and she had not been able to articulate until this moment, standing in the back of a ballroom in the Grand Ashworth Hotel, exactly what she had lost when he went. She understood it now. And she put her hand over her mouth and she let herself cry, and it felt strangely, unexpectedly, like something being set right. The woman from the second row had made her way to the edge of the stage. She was perhaps 65, with silver hair and the steady manner of someone who has learned to act on feeling rather than suppress it. She looked up at Walter. "My mother used to play that piece," she said. Her voice was steady though her eyes were not. "Every Sunday morning. I haven't heard it since she passed." She paused. "Thank you. I don't know why you're here in that uniform, but whoever you are, thank you." Walter looked at her for a long moment. "Her name was Ruth," he said. "My wife, it was her piece." The woman nodded. She understood completely, without needing anything further explained. Edmund had come onto the stage now, and he stood beside Walter with his hand briefly on his shoulder. A gesture of solidarity between two men who had been in the world long enough to know that most of the things worth honoring go unnoticed, and that this is the nature of things, and that the moments of exception are therefore to be held carefully. "Walter," Edmund said quietly, he had learned his name from Clara 10 minutes ago. "Do you know what I was told when I asked about you? I was told you fix things." Walter looked at him. "Yes," he said. Edmund smiled, the small, genuine kind. "You've been fixing the wrong things." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since he had walked into the ballroom, something in his face shifted. Not a smile exactly. Something behind the eyes. A thawing. "Maybe," he said. He did not stay for the reception. There was a reception, wine and warm light, and the particular pleasant noise of people who have shared an experience and want to go on sharing it. Edmund had drawn a small crowd of the genuinely music-loving, and the woman from the second row was among them, and several others who had been in the room for something they were already describing, in the careful way people describe experiences they are not yet certain they deserve, as extraordinary. Walter was invited. Edmund invited him himself, with genuine warmth and no performance of it. "Come," Edmund had said, "there are people who would very much like to speak with you." Walter had thanked him. He had meant the thanks. Edmund Hale was a good man, and Walter had learned over 74 years to recognize good men even when they arrived unexpectedly. But he collected his thermos from the spot near the stage steps where he had left it, and he buttoned his navy coat and he said, "I've had a long day." Edmund looked at him for a moment, then he smiled. "Next week, then," he said. "I'll be in Philadelphia until the 28th. Would you have coffee with me?" "Yes," Walter said, "I think I would." He came down the stage steps carefully, the arthritis in his knees reminding him, as it always did at the end of a long day, of its presence. He walked back through the ballroom, and the conversations that had been beginning at the edge of the room paused, and people looked, and this time the looking was different. He felt it. He did not make anything of it, but he felt it, the way a man feels sun on his face after a long winter, and acknowledges it simply by lifting his face toward it. Near the ballroom doors, he passed Dominic Farrow. Dominic was standing slightly apart from the others, holding a glass of wine that he had not touched. He looked at Walter with an expression that had traveled a very long way in a very short time. There was something in his posture that was younger somehow than it had been that morning, less certain, more human. He opened his mouth. "Mr. Haynes," he began. Walter paused. He looked at the young man steadily, without coldness, without warmth that was not genuine, without any of the complicated things that the morning might have entitled him to feel. "Good evening," Walter said, and he walked on. Not slowly, not quickly. The pace of a man who knows where he is going and is not in a hurry to get there, because the getting there is itself a kind of living. His keys jangled softly at his side, that small, familiar music, and he moved through the ornate lobby of the Grand Ashworth Hotel with its faded brass fixtures and its carpets worn thin by 1,000 footsteps, and he pushed through the front door, not the service entrance, and out into the Philadelphia evening. The cold met him cleanly. The city moved around him in its ordinary way, cars and voices, and the distant hum of a life being lived at volume. He walked to the bus stop and stood beneath the yellow light and breathed. He thought of Ruth. He thought of her in the third row in Boston, hands folded, face illuminated. He thought of her calling his hands beautiful. He thought of the way she used to sit in the armchair beside the piano and close her eyes when he played, not as someone falling asleep, but as someone who has arrived precisely where they wish to be. "I finished it today," he thought, "the nocturne, I finished it." He was not certain entirely whether he was telling himself this or telling her. Perhaps both. Perhaps, for a man who has loved someone long enough, the distinction eventually ceases to matter. The bus came. He climbed aboard, showed his pass to the driver, a large, tired man who recognized Walter the way people recognize familiar things, without particularity, and found his usual seat near the middle, beside the window. The city moved past in the dark. Walter held his thermos in both hands and looked at the window, and in it, at his own faint reflection. A 74-year-old man in a navy coat, with swollen knuckles and patient eyes, and the particular quality of someone who has set something down after carrying it for a very long time. Not lighter exactly, not unburdened, but different. When he arrived home, he hung his coat on the hook beside the door. He set the thermos on the kitchen counter. He filled a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink, looking out at the back garden where Ruth's rose bushes stood bare in the November cold, waiting, as they always did, for spring. Then he walked into the living room. He stood before the piano. It was an upright, nothing like the Steinway, nothing like the grand instruments he had known in his youth, but it was his. And it had been Ruth's, and it held, in its wood and its wire and its worn ivory keys, more of their shared life than any other object in the house. He lifted the lid. He sat down. He placed his hands on the keys gently, as one places a hand on the shoulder of an old friend, and he sat for a moment in the particular silence of a house that holds an absence, and he breathed. Then he began to play. Not the nocturne this time. Something new, or rather, something old that he had not allowed himself in years. Something that began quietly and built with the unhurried certainty of a man who has decided, not dramatically, not with declaration but simply and irrevocably, to return to himself. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare rose bushes. Inside, the house, which had been very quiet for 7 years, was full of music. Walter Haynes was not discovered that evening. He was not rescued or transformed or made into something he had not always been. He was simply at last heard, and sometimes, after a long silence, that is everything. The end.